Hi, everybody. Welcome to the panel. I see that folks are still filing in, so as you all sit down and get comfy and greet your neighbors, and I'm kidding, actually, I'm sure nobody's sitting next to anybody anymore. I'll introduce myself. My name is Wendy Nather, and I lead the advisory CISO team at Duo Security, which is now part of Cisco. And I love to be involved with the Cyber 912 competitions as a judge or as a speaker or whatever. And so I was very excited to be able to moderate this panel, which is called You Want Us to Do What Now? CISO Views on Public-Private Partnerships. And I have several CISOs here with me to talk about this, and I think it's a very important topic because in my experience, both working as a CISO and working in the public sector, I find that there are things that CISOs would really like to be able to say to government and just can't quite bring themselves to do it. It might be something like, thanks, we got this. Or, are you kidding? These IOCs are 2 months old, or things like that. So that's why I'm really excited to have the panelists here, and I will ask them to introduce themselves, starting with Nick. Nick, could you please introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, Wendy. So I am Nick Anderson. I'm the CISO for Public Sector at Lumen Technologies. I'm a recently recovering government employee, where I was last the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Department of Energy, and I ran the Office of Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response, or CSER.
Great. Now I'll go to Megan. Megan?
Great. No, hello. It's wonderful to be here with everyone today. I'm Megan Sanford. I'm the Vice President, Chief Product Security Officer for the energy management business within Schneider Electric.
Fascinating. Thank you. And Helen.
Hi, everybody. My name's Helen Patton. Most recently, I was the Chief Information Security Officer at The Ohio State University in beautiful downtown Columbus, Ohio. And I'm super excited to be here. So thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Let's go ahead and get started with some questions. And this is one that always comes up. I also worked at the Retail Intelligence Sharing and Analysis Center, and this came up a lot. One of the most popular requests that the public sector makes of the private sector is information sharing. Now, how does this play out in reality in your experience? Let me start with Nick to talk about this.
Sure. I mean, information sharing, we know, is hypercritical to everyone across the spectrum, both on the government side and on the private sector side. So in my last role, I was in that position of just wanting to glob up all the data that I could, gather it all, be able to look at it against classified sources and methods, and be able to have informed conversations with the people that were owning the risk, the critical infrastructure owners and operators, in particular for us within the energy sector. And we know that this is going to continue to be a strategic priority moving forward. I mean, just as recently as today, where we've seen the interim strategic guidance regarding national security priorities, coming out of the new administration, and they specifically cite elements like robust law enforcement and intelligence capabilities being required, and strong cooperation and appropriate information sharing is being necessary to success for achieving our national security goals. But really, information sharing is much more than simply, I'm seeing something and I need to share something. It's a broader risk conversation that involves the risk owners, it involves counsel, it involves technical personnel within organizations, and really always needs to be informed with the why. What are we trying to get to here? What is the value of sharing this information, and making sure that it's bidirectional, making sure that there's value for everybody involved. And that most importantly, kind of the one of your points in our opening, making sure that it's timely, making sure that it's actionable, that it's not just information sharing for the sake of information sharing. So I can certainly understand why government would want to partner with somebody like us, at Lumen, where we kind of look at the amount of information that we're seeing every single day. We've got 450,000 route miles of fiber and a global footprint. And our Black Lotus Lab folks are ingesting like 190 billion NetFlow sessions a day, and upwards of 700 million DNS queries daily. But how is that information contextualized within the government space? How is risk and threat appropriately communicated back to private sector critical infrastructure owner operators? And how are we jointly working in priorities? All of these emerging threats that we see today have to be managed. When we look at managing national security, we look at managing public safety, we look at health issues, we look at continuity within our economy and national economic goals. Those are all shared risk factors that we have to take on. So we really have to work collaboratively together to make sure that we're sharing actionable information, that we're actually moving towards outcome-oriented events with information sharing, and there's that mutual benefit there.
Yeah, and that it's not just one way, because a lot of private sector companies complain that when the public sector says information sharing, they really mean you tell us stuff, and we're not going to tell you anything. So yeah, that's great. By the way, I want to remind everybody to please put in questions in the Q&A chat form at the bottom of your screen. As you think of them, we will get to them at the end here. Megan, would you like to go next?
No, sure. Thank you. For me, sharing of information, and especially in the context of cyber intelligence, it's really about two things. It's about calibration and it's about maneuver room. In other words, when I'm sharing information with the government or vice versa, the calibration is important in that I would like to know if what I'm seeing is what they're seeing and vice versa, and that we're devoting the appropriate amount of attention and resources towards that. And that leads directly into the maneuver part, which is we want cyber intelligence and we want information and we want to have confidence in the way that we're allocating resources and buying down risk to give decision makers more maneuver room ahead of something bad happening so that we can ensure that we're adequately prepared.
All right, great. Helen, you want to put your 2 cents in?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one of the biggest challenges about doing private-public sharing is that if it's top secret, no one wants to share it. And if it's not top secret and it's public, all the context has been stripped from it. So what ends up happening is, as a chief information security officer of an organization, if you're going to receive the information and it's largely public, it's also largely meaningless. I can't tell why the IOC is being pushed forward by whatever the agency is. I don't know what kinds of technology environments those things sit in. Simply saying, well, you've got an instance of Office 365 or you're using a Google Share doesn't necessarily mean that that's a risk I have to worry about related to that particular notice that's coming from the FBI or the Department of Homeland Security or whatever. So if it's so public that they can share it widely, it's meaningless. But in order to get that context in my organization, someone needs to have at least top secret security clearance, if not higher. And we've got to have very real-time access to people to have a conversation, which doesn't scale very well, either on my side or on the side of the government agency. So it becomes a really problematic situation. And as we think about some of the policy proposals that have been put forward this morning and that will get put forward this afternoon, thinking about it's not enough just to say, hey, the private sector is going to talk to the public sector or vice versa. There really needs to be intentional thought about how quickly that's going to happen, to what degree are you going to share information, and how do you move forward with that?
Yeah, thanks for that, Helen. And it's really important to keep in mind that for a private sector company, especially a publicly traded company, there are a lot of hurdles that they have to clear in order to be able to share any kind of useful information at all. The legal people, the PR people, all the business people are terrified of you sharing, as a CISO, sharing information that, could reveal something that they don't want to have revealed. Now, one thing that we did recommend in the retail ISAC was coming up with templates to get pre-blessed by your legal people to say, there are times when we're going to want to share, if it has to do with an email, we're going to want to share who it's to, We're going to want to share who it's from. We're going to want to share the content of the email. Is it okay to do all of this within this particular group? And get them to bless those ahead of time, because otherwise it could take a really long time, even if, as a government official, if you come to a company, it's going to start with their government relations people. They're going to panic. They're going to go to legal, and it could take a really long time to get the information that you're after. So that's another thing to think about when you are expecting to rely on information from the private sector. Setting up those channels ahead of time may help a lot. All right, let's go to the next question. What are some of the challenges you've seen in working with the public sector on incidents, whether they affect your organization directly or not? Who wants to take this one to start with?
Let's go in reverse order. I'll take this one to
Okay.
start.
Great.
I think the first thing I would say, again, timeliness is everything. So some of the challenges have been how quickly the information comes to you, but also being able to know whether that is something that's widespread or something that's unique to you. So the agencies very much give you only as much information as they need you to have. And so being able to correlate that information to the broader business sense of the environment you operate in, who your partners are and so forth, can be really, really challenging. I think that the second thing to think about as we've worked with the private sector, the public sector, is, to your earlier point, how many people at an organization really do need to get involved. And so procedurally, if an external government agency comes to a company and says, hey, there's this thing that you need to know about, it is usually 4 or 5 different levels of people that need to get involved before you can even then begin to do the work of the technology investigation that might go along with it. So those things slow you down, frankly, and most technology, or most technologists, most folks who are working in the security space, don't have time to deal with the government if they're actually under an attack of some sort. So they're not staffed to have someone dealing with the government agency while they're also dealing with a ransomware event or whatever the situation of the day is. And so the agency is not going to be welcome unless they're going to be helpful. And it's really hard to be both of those things at the same time.
Good point. Megan?
Sure. This is an area that I'm personally very passionate about. There's an effort underway called the use of incident command system for industrial control systems. And at the heart of it, it's about having a plug and play response framework that private sector organizations can utilize in their response planning with their own response plans, in coordination with the US government and other governments globally. Essentially, there's a system called National Incident Management System, NIMS, and Incident Command System is a framework that falls underneath that. If you've ever come in contact with local firefighters or police officers or the military, they all follow this common construct for incident command system and the way that incidents are run. But in the private sector, it's still much very different, meaning my cyber response plan could look very different than Nick's or Helen's. And so this is really all about having a common language and framework by which the private sector and the federal government could work together during incidents, as well as having individuals and companies able to share response duties with one another. Meaning for example, the person that runs the response may be called an incident commander in one organization, and another they could have a different role or title. But it's about selection of common capabilities that we would all need to bring to bear and respond, and how we could be interoperable in the way that we work together. Today, we're just kind of starting on this journey, but it is getting some traction and having these plug and play frameworks. And it's unique in my mind because in every other quote unquote response entity with utilities or other disasters that happen in the United States or globally, you have this framework where first responders from one locality can plug and play with another. And I think that you're seeing a willingness for us to want to cooperate on that level with cyber as well.
Great. Nick, what are your thoughts on this?
So many thoughts on it, but I'm not nearly as articulate as Megan is on it. I think using the National Incident Management System is a fantastic idea, and for all the reasons that Megan articulated. And it really gets down to, how are we going to work together? Because so many of these incidents are going to have these cascading cross-sector impacts, and we really need to be able to work together, across industry, work together across government. Where this is played out in a couple of different spaces, and like the state of Louisiana a couple of years ago, the governor declared a state of emergency, and I believe it was their public school systems that were falling victim to malicious actors' work. They started to implement what they called ESF 17, or Emergency Support Function 17, which was for cyber incident coordination. We have structures like in the energy sector. ESF 12 is energy, and when we very clearly know when there's a physical all hazards type of event, hurricane, earthquake, tornado, whatever it may be, everybody kind of knows their role that they're playing. They know how they're lining up with an incident commander. They know who's performing that operations function, that planning function, et cetera. When we look at all of the impacts that we have within a cyber incident, it's going to have so many different cascading impacts. And I think, the participants, today, within the Cyber 912 challenge are seeing some of that and seeing how they have to work cross-sector to facilitate those types of actions. So getting to something nationally where we can look at best of breed available resources on the industry side and the government side to come together to fit those roles and being able to move, across those roles flexibly. I think it's going to be really, really important for us to find efficiency and effectiveness in being able to respond to ensure continuity of the economy and looking out for the public safety and making sure that we have availability of these resources that everybody relies upon every day, but don't necessarily think about until they're not available.
Really good point. And to build on what everybody's been saying, especially Megan and Helen, in a lot of companies in the private sector, you would not believe it, but they usually don't have very many security people at all. On Twitter the other day, I just asked, how many people who are following me are CISOs in manufacturing? And I got a lot of answers going, I don't know, I guess I am, because I'm the only person doing security. And of course, I don't know how large those companies are, but just because they're in a particular sector, you can't assume that they have a fully staffed security function, that they have incident commanders. You'll be reaching out to them going, who's your incident commander? I guess that's me. Who's doing your backups? Oh, I guess that's me. Who's doing the network cabling? Me. So when it comes to responding to incidents and dealing with communications, sometimes you're not really sure who you're going to get. Again, as when I was working for the retail ISAC and would try to reach out to some companies, some retailers, to give them breach notifications or threat intelligence, they would not have any publicly available email or anything that I could reach out to. So I'd have to use like the customer support form and say, I'm trying to reach your security people. I need to talk to them. And either they wouldn't believe me, or they'd say, oh, I'm sorry you didn't like your dress, ma'am. And I've got, no, it's not about the dress. I'm trying to talk to your security people. So again, think about those things as well. We're very lucky in that the CISOs we have here today are, very high level seasoned professionals, but I could have just as easily have brought in some people who are stuck with the whole role of security for the first time and are not really sure if they get a call from somebody claiming to be an FBI agent, they have no idea whether to believe it or not, or what they should be doing. So keep that in mind as well. Please make sure to keep putting questions in the Q&A. And I see there's one already. Thank you. And as we go to our next question, whom would you trust and approach in the public sector if you needed urgent help with an incident? Whom would you trust? There are a lot of government and law enforcement agencies out there, who would you go to? Who wants that first? Helen?
Oh, sure. I'll take that first. So in my role at Ohio State, we had a very close relationship actually with the FBI for a variety of reasons. We had a very active FBI shop that was in the same city. There was a number of partnerships that we worked with them on. And so at a high level, I'd say you're going to go with the people you know, even if they may not exactly be the right people for the incident at hand. They're a start. So, you know, you'd think about that. Now, if the scope of the incident was really huge, there's no way that I could call up anybody in the federal government and expect them to take my call. So I might have to work through my government relations people maybe to reach out to somebody who has the ear of somebody who could get hold of somebody in the right agency. It's really tough, and most of the agencies obviously can't scale to be everywhere for everyone either. So short answer, I'd go with the person that I know, assuming I know anybody at all.
Yeah, good point. Megan, you next?
Sure. In my mind, and this kind of goes back to National Incident Management System, and that typically the groups that are running the incident are those that you believe have the most resources to bring to bear. So if this was something that was very energy sector specific, I would go to Department of Energy. I would definitely reach out to Cheryl Caddy and Ginger Wright and that group over there to assist. If it was something that I felt was very broad, very impacting, more along the lines of critical manufacturing sector, then I'd most likely reach out to Department of Homeland Security and Mark Bristow and the HURT team there. And if it was something where it was very central to a geographic region, or there was belief that there was very clear criminal activity behind it, maybe I would go to FBI first. If you're in a case where you have a lot of the data available to you at that time, you can clearly say what happened, and you're looking for kind of the law enforcement angle of it. It's an example I use. If you have the murder weapon and you have the dead body, then it makes it pretty easy to interact with FBI and go down that road. But I've never come across an incident or a case where several different parties did not eventually become involved at some point. And I think the US government has made tremendous effort in this area to be inclusive of other agencies and really everyone to have a role in this type of theater and to be able to play that role respective of one another. So it's definitely an improvement area I've seen over the last 5 years.
Yeah, cool. And Nick?
I think it's interesting because to Helen's point, a lot of times it really is who you know and who you're comfortable with, because again, there's just so many organizational dynamics at play regarding kind of counsel's advice and who you sort of have your playbook set up to go to first. There are some places that are very, very close to FBI because they have active, FBI offices that are very, very forward-leaning and are integrated with the community and integrated with those critical elements that they know they need to work with in a time of crisis. There are some that have very close relationships with their sector-specific agencies, like Megan mentioned, the Department of Energy. And there are some that just know, hey, you know what? I've heard that DHS does this cyber stuff. I'm going to reach out to DHS. But an interesting factor, because again, we're talking about kind of some of the constraints and the nuances of public sector and private sector collaboration. A lot of people are looking to things like cyber insurance to help drive down some of their risk and buy down some of their corporate risk. And in some instances, that may have some constraints with how they begin to kind of interact and share information with others. That could come with constraints on who they involve, on incident response retainers, on sharing of information, on who they alert first, on who those corporate responsible officers are that have a duty to report information when it's discovered, to their insurer that are involved. There's lots and lots of different factors that all kind of go into this. How do I reach out to somebody? When do I reach out to somebody? And there's vast inequity when it comes to resources and standardization across the board. So I'll keep kind of using the energy sector as an example, because Megan touched on that a second ago as well. This is everything from massive utilities that are out there that have fully mature cyber threat intelligence shops and defensive operations and cleared personnel that are coming out and are veterans of working in these federal organizations and have those relationships, all the way down to local munis and co-ops that don't have anywhere near those resources. And they kind of have people that are jacks of all trades in a lot of instances. Like you said, Wendy, they're the person who's doing the networking, and they're the security person, and maybe they're the incident commander when something happens, and maybe they're cutting the grass on Fridays. It's kind of pick it up and you do whatever you can do. And I think this plays it out as well in a bunch of like our state and local governments, and how they have to play in the incident response game. So it really is sort of all over the map with who you reach out to. And that's why relationship building and building of capacity and capability is something that's going to be so critical for government to continue to invest in that space. Because this isn't just about survivability or reliability of a single corporate entity and the services that they're providing or the goods that they're providing. Again, this is really about national security, public health, continuity of our economy, and like really kind of continuing to support the pillars of civilization as we know it today.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that. I was just reminded of a time when I was working for the Texas Education Agency, and we were trying to reach out to a superintendent in a particular Texas district who was not only the superintendent, but he coached the local high school girls basketball team. And when we called him, he was busy bringing in the crops. So you never know what you're going to find when you're reaching out to deal with an incident. The other problem is that with law enforcement, often they can only take on cases, with a certain amount of dollar loss attached to it. And if you are below that, or you don't know what the damage is yet, they can't help you. And that's very frustrating for the private sector, because if they don't know who to call and they call local law enforcement and they say, well, when you get to 50,000, come back and talk to us. That's really tough. So again, it is a case of who do you know? I might call up Trey Hare and say, do you know anybody in this particular agency? You must have talked to somebody. So that's the problem. But the upside is that a lot of CISOs talk to one another. And in fact, they can often talk one-to-one and share information faster than if you give it to the public sector, to DHS. They have to spend a lot of time sanitizing it, and then it comes back 5 weeks later and it's got all the useful stuff stripped out of it. So I do believe that there is a time when the public sector can help, and there's a time when you need to move fast, or when you need to scale, when you need to be able to step out of the way and let the private sector handle it. Is there any one of you want to argue that point?
No, I think that you're exactly right, Wendy. I think that if you're a fan of Stephen Covey, everything moves at the speed of trust, right?
Very good point. Yeah, it sure does. Yeah. Anybody else want to fight? You can fight in the Q&A too. I don't care. Put your question in there too. All right. One more question before we get to, and the other thing that's really frustrating to the private sector when they're dealing with an incident is the fact that so many different public sector agencies often have turf wars over who owns an incident. And like, oh yeah, we can't work on this part because this belongs to this other agency, or yeah, we just got told to stand down because this other thing was happening. So that's another thing to keep in mind, that the public sector, just like the private sector, is not a monolith, and sometimes it does more harm than good to try to reach out to a bunch of different agencies to see if you can get somebody to help you, and then suddenly you have too many agencies trying to be helpy. And then then you have to deal with that part. Let me get to the last question, which is for each of you. What advice would you give policymakers who are trying to get up to speed on a cybersecurity issue in a hurry? What is this blockchain thing anyway? Or whatever?
Well, I
Go
think
ahead.
it's a couple of different things. I think there has to be a willingness for private sector to be engaged in the formative early stages of developing a policy position around anything, whether it's emerging technology, whether it's threat and risk area that's entering into the conversation. And there's a general hesitancy, guilty of it, as a former government person as well, to go out too early to have conversations with those in the private sector and say, hey, here's kind of the problem that we're working on. Here are some of the potential policy solutions that we're looking at in this space. What are your thoughts? What's your feedback? How does this fit in, and what would the impacts be to you? That, and we're just generally constrained when we're sitting on the public sector side with FACA rules, federal advisory council rules, being able to share information, providing public notice of proposed rulemaking, and everything you have to do in the Federal Register, all of that sort of nonsense. That makes people feel like they're constrained in some ways in doing that. But bringing private sector to the table early, when there's even something that you're not really sure that there's some there when it's a problem that needs to be solved, I think is really invaluable. The sector coordinating councils function that are part of what DHS and the sector specific agencies can use to kind of convene those groups to, in a protected way, exchange information is great. There are a couple of critical gaps in the SCC structure, in particular when we start talking about control systems and operational technology and all the things that go into that, and making sure that group has a seat at the table. But being able to be forward-leaning and open to those conversations, I think, would be one of my recommendations. I think my other would be just making sure that we're doing the work ahead of time to kind of come up to speed on the nuance of what's required for incident response and for cyber issues in general, to be able to understand, kind of like a 100 coin drill. If I've only got 100 coins to be able to spread around the table to apply to any sort of major catastrophe or incident that represents my available resources, where am I going to spread them? How do I need to be able to coordinate with the private sector to understand what are private sector resources that can be applied to solve some of this problem? Where should the public sector resources best be applied to solve some of this problem? And continuing to kind of game that out and have those conversations. I think a lot of the frustration that private sector security professionals kind of voice is a point that we just brought up a few minutes ago of too many agencies and too many departments showing up trying to be helpy. It's not helpful necessarily in the heat of the moment, but being able to have those conversations and have that understanding of how we're going to react and how we're going to apply those resources in the best way ahead of time, that's just that helps pay dividends over the long term.
Yeah, Megan.
Sure, and thank you. To me, it's about an open dialogue around real world risk modeling, right? I've seen there are cases in security, especially, where we seek to hyper control things that are relatively easy for us to measure, things like vulnerabilities, for example. And when you take that into the context of the industrial control system environment and asset owners and operators, it's easy to really get hung up on, well, we need to patch these vulnerabilities, we need to do X, Y, and Z because of the severity or the CVSS scoring for this one vulnerability, where in reality, the asset could have products hanging directly out on the internet, and so they have massive exposure. And so it's really about proper calibration on vulnerabilities. Are pretty easy to measure, they're pretty easy to track. We can get hung up on patching and become obsessed with equities that we believe that patching will get us in terms of our security posture. But at the end of the day, if you're obsessed with patching, but you have an HMI directly exposed to the internet, you have much larger fish to fry in terms of orders of magnitude. And I think that more resources from the government could be put behind general education in areas like OT and ICS cybersecurity on exposure and understanding the way that these networks work, understanding how they're different than traditional enterprise networks, and some things that we have held to high esteem in terms of our security maturity on the enterprise side don't translate well into ICS or OT security in some cases. And really just having more of an open dialogue around how companies analyze risk, how they work with their customers. And a thing that I've been really big on lately, and this is actually coming out of Department of Energy right now, is cyber-informed engineering, right? If we have a limited number of resources, if we can engineer out in the way that we build products and systems and the way that they're maintained in customer environments, if we can engineer out the cyber issues, right, rather than constantly patching or other kind of compensating controls, then that's probably where we need to be putting more of our resources going forward. So love that effort. I'll end on a high note there with kind of cheerleading a little bit for that effort, because I think that it's thinking about risk in a more proactive way that really brings the biggest bang for the buck, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's the first time I've heard cyber-informed engineering,
Yes.
and I love that. That is so
Yes.
cool.
If you don't remember anything else from the call, definitely look that up.
Cyber-informed engineering. That is cool. All right, Helen, what you got?
So I think if we go back to the original question, which is, you know, if there's a cyber thing come up, how do you come up to speed from a policy perspective, and where do you go to get information on it? When you're an operational CISO, I think you do care about how did we get here, right? What are all the things that we've been talking about? What are the vulnerabilities? What are the configurations and so forth? From a policy perspective, I think you have to start with impact, right? So if you've got a ransomware event that takes down one small university, what's the impact of that? If you have a ransomware event that takes down all of Wall Street, what's the impact of that? How is the impact of that any different than a major hurricane hitting the east coast of the United States? Is it any different? What would be what would the fact that it's a cyber event make different than if it was a natural event or a military event or whatever the situation is, right? So when you think about the policy and then what the potential policy outcomes and options might be, I think if you think of it in terms of what is the impact of the event and not spend too much time getting hung up on the technical detail of how the cyber event occurred, it's going to be easier from a policy perspective to think about who are the stakeholders and what are the public levers that can get pulled to help, and whether or not we need to activate an emergency response organization. And if so, what does that emergency response organization or incident response framework look like? So for me, I think we've got to start with understanding the impact and whether or not that's a domestic issue, a local, state, national issue, or an international issue, and then engage appropriately.
Wow, that's food for thought. That's really good. Like, don't get too into the whole Bitcoin thing. Just worry about the fact that the power's out. You know, and yeah, focus on the impact and learn about what the actual impact is going to be in people's lives, in the economy, in operations, and all that kind of stuff. That's great. All right, it's Q&A time, and we have got some great questions in here. Let me start with this one. How does being remote in the COVID-19 environment affect the role of incident response in relation to network security in government and private sector? Who wants to tackle that one? How does COVID affect incident response and remote working? Well, first of all, you can't just buy a whole bunch of pizzas and put them together in one place. You got to send a pizza to everybody who's responding at their homes. But anyway, Helen, you look like you're ready to say something.
Yeah, I would encourage you to think about it in terms of supply chain, because you know, pre-COVID, a company or an agency had a reasonable understanding of where their people were, where their data is, where their networks are. And I think COVID is accelerating the fact that our data is everywhere and our people are everywhere. and they're not in the same spot. And now we're hyper reliant on technology for communications in particular in ways that we weren't before. So the fundamental ingredient of incident response is communications. So if everybody is on Zoom or pick your teleconferencing platform of choice, can you still do what you need to do when everybody's in that particular mode? And so I don't think this is a brand new concept for anybody to be thinking about. I think we've been trending this way for a while, but I think COVID's accelerated those concerns.
All right, great. Either Nick or Megan, you got some thoughts on this?
The one thing that came to mind for me was I had heard a really fascinating view on the fact that the home office has now become an extension of the corporate office, right? And so I think that you've seen individuals really try to get up to speed on kind of their home network security, and hopefully not having default passwords and routers and things like that, because that can cause problems on the enterprise side of the house. I think that's interesting. Another question kind of flipping the way that we're viewing this, and that when it comes to getting people together for incident response, everyone is kind of less mobile, so they're in their homes, and maybe response time SLAs have actually increased due to people being more available and by their home computers. But I haven't seen any stats around that. That would be an interesting thing to pull on how organizations have seen an increase in incidents that they're running, or a decrease, and what they think their surge capacity is in being able to more successfully respond today versus 2 years ago, right? I know that we would run rotations for people being on call versus not on call, if you were taking a weekend off or having your cell phone by you, waking up at 2 o'clock in the morning, all of those things. I think that would be an interesting discussion overall.
Yeah, it's an interesting problem, because a lot of organizations, when their workers all went home, had to realize that some of their security models that were based in a centralized, authoritarian kind of structure, where they ran everything and controlled everything, don't work anymore. So a very simple thing like, if one of your workers' endpoints gets infected and they're at home, you can't scan them, because the ISP is going to see that scan as an attack and block it. You can't go to an organization and say, we need you to take your network down, and they're going to be like, great, what network? Everything's in SaaS, and everything is in people's residences now. What network did you want us to take down? So there are some things that we reach for in incident response automatically that just aren't practical anymore. And Nick, any thoughts from your side?
I think it just, I think the biggest change, in addition to what you just mentioned with kind of the change in the assessment of the model, is the change in sort of awareness about what are our priorities for protection and what are our priorities for incident response, and how does this affect the business now that we've developed new technology and developed new models of conducting our business. So before, those sort of collaboration technologies and the technologies that enable everybody to be working from home and participating in panels, like we're doing here today, those things may not have been part of the what the business considered to be their critical applications and their critical infrastructure for continuing to succeed and thrive in this sort of distributed environment. But it really sort of changes the model about how we have to look at risk and how we prioritize incident response, and where we put our limited resources on focus on business continuity.
Yeah, very good point. Very good point. All right, here's another question that I love. Have any attempts to cooperate with government ended badly? What's the worst outcome? And I remember from my own CISO days, things like, law enforcement or whatever coming in and saying, okay, we actually, I think it was the DEA, they came and said, yeah, we need to investigate something. We're just going to take this server, thank you, and you're going to get it back in a couple of years. So that didn't help a whole lot. Megan, any good stories on your side?
I won't say that it's on my side or not, but I have heard of incidents where, say you're running a response and you discover particular data sets or information, and you engage with the government on information sharing, and clearances can be passed and information can be shared at a classified level. But then once one of your responders knows that that information that they took into the meeting is now classified, they can't go back and discuss that information with the rest of the team in a way that it's unclassified. And so there's a concept called shielding that can come into play when you need to coordinate and run responses with the government, and there may be classified material in play there. There are ways of doing it. And to be clear, I don't want anyone to think that you shouldn't have cleared personnel and you shouldn't be sharing that information and going through that process. But that is something that I encourage people in their response planning to work through, and that who on your team is going to have a clearance and have access to this information and run the incident from this angle, and who are we intentionally not going to have cleared that will be running the incident from another angle, so that they're able to share information easily and things like that. And the other thing I would say is that all private sector entities, as well as government, you always worry about, we're trusting in another party, sensitive and confidential information. We hope that the information stays within that entity and is not somehow leaked out of the response, right? That I think most of the private sector says, you never want to end up on the front page of the New York Times. That's always something that whenever information leaves your organization, you're always cautious about who has it and who could be saying what to whom and who is authorized to speak about what's happening. And in many cases, information gets out unintentionally, and it's not because of malice or anything like that. It's that so many people may know, and information creeps, right? So that would be another angle I think that people would have anxiety about.
That's a really good takeaway for policymakers and for government, that when you are starting to work with an organization, explain to them ahead of time what this all means, what the implications are, and say ahead of time, if we ask you to segment off your incident response team for classification reasons, who do you want in, who do you want out? Here are the things to think about. It never hurts to explain the implications ahead of time. Let me see, who would like to share something else? Helen, you got any good comments about what's the worst that could happen working with government?
Well, the imagination can run wild, right? I think the one for our policymakers, I think that one of the challenges that you have to understand is that the context of data changes from day to day and minute to minute and hour to hour. And when it changes, the regulations that govern that data change with it. So I'll give you an example. If you break your arm while you're walking across campus, that's actually considered FERPA data or educational data, not medical data. If you just off campus, then go and tell a police officer that you broke your arm, that's now public information. And if he puts you in the back of his cruiser or her cruiser and takes you to hospital and you get checked in, now that is HIPAA information. And our government agencies ask each of those groups to manage their data differently depending on the context of the data in which they gathered it. But it's the same data, Helen broke her arm or whatever the situation is, right? So as we're trying to think about public policy, think about the policies that are already there. Think about the administrative rules that are already there. Think about, it's not just what does the FBI want to do with this? It's what does the FBI want to do with this, but also what does the National Institutes of Health want to do, and the FDA and the DOD and are they all in alignment? And right now the answer is no. So if you're an operational person trying to work out how do you do an incident with a government agency, you can't ask that question. You have to say, how do I run this incident in relation to every government agency that I have to touch? And that's super complicated. So yes, it can, and it occasionally does end badly, not because people have bad policy in their own silos, but because all of those policies overlap and make it very confusing.
That is such an important point, and people may not realize that places like where Helen was CISO at the Ohio State University, it's not just an academic institution. And it, you know, because they have what you had a hospital, you had a hotel, you had research
Airport.
labs, an airport, you had a freaking nuclear reactor, you know, so those are, you know, like mini cities in effect. And so the cybersecurity implications and the regulatory implications are much more complex than people understand and realize. That's great. All right. I think we got time for maybe one, maybe two more questions. As the U.S. government determines how the Office of the National Cyber Director will be implemented, do you see any lessons from the private sector and the CISO role that could be applied to this role in government, the role of the Office of the National Cyber Director?
Yep, I'd like to jump in on this one. Yeah, so the NDAA, I think, is really great legislation. One of the things that's in there that you may not have seen yet is that it does allow for the creation of an advisory board that is made up, I think, of up to 20 or 30, I'm going to get the number wrong, of operational CISOs representing different industry verticals. I think it's really important that the new director has partnerships and voices from all the stakeholder groups that they're ultimately going to be overseeing. And this happens in the private sector and within a company as well. A CISO doesn't just do their job in a vacuum. They have partners, they have advisory boards, they have boards of trustees, you know, those kinds of things. They're informing them about what is the appropriate risk appetite to have and what the culture will allow in terms of action. And I think with this new legislation, that new director is going to need to have that same kind of advisory group around them to make sure that the things they're doing are reasonable and consumable and are not impractical in the environment that they're going to be working in.
Great. Nick?
Sure. So I think insofar as the National Cyber Director is going to be concerned, I think it's going to be really, really important to make sure that just like a CISO in the private sector, it's very easy to get consumed with the tactical. It's very easy to get consumed with the individual incident, with an individual vulnerability, with a, you know, oh my gosh, you know, Ann Johnson tweeted something in the middle of the night about a 0-day. What do I go do now? It's very easy to get consumed with those individual elements of what I need to be doing. We've got lots and lots of people across the government space that are doing that today. The National Cyber Director should really be focused on the strategic, on how do I pull all of the different levers that I can pull to really affect national strategy to move us forward. You know, the private sector wants to be involved. Private sector wants to be good partners. You know, we understand that we are key elements of, you know, national security, of continuity of the economy, of ensuring public health and safety, and we want to be part of that strategic conversation. But there are key elements that we need to shore up to continue to allow, you know, for facilitating that participation and kind of pulling it all together into a strategic risk picture. You know, Megan mentioned, you know, CCE earlier, you know, that INL has done a lot of work on. I think Sarah Freeman and Andy Bachman, I think, just published another book about it, about a lot of the work that Mike Asante helped to, you know, to pick up when he was still working in that space. And it's really about ruthlessly prioritizing that risk. You know, we can't afford to continue to do the peanut butter spread of all risk is created equal. And we're going to do a strategy that's going to fix everything. And it's all, you know, motherhood and apple pie. This is fantastic. We're going to tackle everything equally. We can't tackle everything equally. We really have to understand what are those critical functions and what are our nation's most complex systems, and how an adversary is going to help, you know, hope to try to manipulate and compromise those critical functions, and how we're just going to engineer out the risk, remove the policy barriers, remove the legal and regulatory barriers, so that we can start to move forward collaboratively.
Yeah. Megan.
Sure. I think if I were queen for the day in that role, I would take it back old school. I would take it back to like 2005 when they were standing up the Critical Infrastructure Protection Directorate. When I was back in the Commonwealth of Virginia in the governor's office as the SIP director for Virginia, and I would categorically identify and I would prioritize my most significant critical infrastructures across the country. And from there, I would take those lists and I would assign protective security advisors, in this case, cybersecurity advisors, to work with those assets and owners to understand their risk, understand where those critical gaps are, and then work with the government on an understanding of buying down that risk in a very deliberate and mechanical way. And I would really keep the main thing the main thing. In addition to that, I would also mandate that common response structures be put in place and that owners and operators know how to integrate with their local emergency operations centers as well as state emergency operations centers for rapid restoration and prioritization of resources in the event that something bad did happen, to ensure that these infrastructures get back up and running. Because at the end of the day, cyber is the vehicle, right? What really counts is the actual assets and the information that's flowing across there, and the ability for the supply chains to continue to stand up in the event of very catastrophic attacks. And those that are localized, the information needs to flow and the resources still need to be available to them. But at the end of the day, you can prevent catastrophes by ensuring that supply chains don't break down during disasters. And so that would be my hot take.
Oh, that is a hot take. All right. Finally, wrapping up, any words of encouragement for our competitive teams for this day and for tomorrow? Who'd like to go first?
I would just say, so far, after judging this morning, I've been super impressed by the teams, the preparation that you've done, the knowledge you have around policy, not just US policy, but international policy. So, trust in the work that you've already put into this effort. And I think you'll do just fine. These are super complicated scenarios that you're being asked to deal with, as you well know. And no one's going to have all the right answers on any one of them. So just go for it and you'll be great.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah, trust yourself, trust your knowledge. But as I do every morning when I wake up, remember what you don't know, because yeah, that's what cybersecurity is all about. We were all making this up as fast as we can. So you're not alone in trying to figure out, okay, how can we do this? Megan or Nick?
Yeah, I would just say keep thinking about the second and third order effects of any actions that we take, and continue to think broadly about partnerships and the opportunity to collaborate, regarding an incident, and how we can sort of move the ball along.
Yep, and I would just say, don't discount the basic principles of security and risk analysis and risk modeling, and take it one day at a time, and leverage your partnerships and leverage your network as well for information, all the things that we stated before. And I always go back to basic security principles around have an asset inventory. You can't do risk management unless you can do asset management, and asset management is always a great place to start in cybersecurity.
Yeah, that is so true. All right. Thank you, everybody, all the panelists, for sharing their knowledge. Thank you for all the great questions. I will hand this back to our master of ceremonies.